raise it up higher.
Yeah.
You won't need it for this guy, but I have to have this. Good to see y'all. These programs are usually held at the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. While the museum is closed for renovations and upgrading of some things, the library's been kind enough to let us have these programs here. This one's a little different. It's not on a Friday because of what today is, and the subject being Tales of Gore and Folklore, which Joe Long knows all about as the curator of education at the museum. The museum itself is set to reopen after being closed to general admission for several months on December 6th, right?
December 7th.
December 6th. Okay.
6th, right.
This is the executive director of the museum, Alan Robertson. First time he's been to one of these, so we're glad to have him.
I made it.
Anyway, before that, you'll start to be seeing some activity in the area. It's going to host the Toy Soldier Show that is put on each year by the South Carolina Military Miniature Society. And that is a lot of fun if you haven't been to one before. It's going to be on November 9th, Saturday, from 10 a.m. to 3. Then 2 days later, on Veterans Day, which actually is on a Monday this time, November 11th, we're going to have another program right here. It won't be Joe, it'll be Fritz Hamer presenting a program about the Battle of Nha Trang, which was the first major battle between the U.S. Army and North Vietnamese regulars in 1965, and is well known to a lot of folks through the movie We Were Soldiers. If we don't already have your email address, please, before you leave, write it on this sign-in sheet over here, because we got a lot of plans coming and they change sometimes, and we want to keep you up to date on what's coming up. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Long, who needs no microphone.
Thank you very much. If he's wrong about that and anybody's having trouble hearing me, just wave a hand and we'll fix that. And I appreciate y'all coming out at noon to indulge me in telling some stories. I am Joe Long. I'm the curator of education for the state's oldest military history museum. The Relic Room's been a museum since 1896, which means we overlap a couple of these stories that we'll be telling today. And something that happens in the course of researching exhibits and programs, and Gore and Folklore was originally the title of a program at the museum, is that you bump into stories that don't quite fit exhibits and are just too good to let go of. And the stories you will hear today are all historically based, but the title here is Gore and Folklore. There will be some gore. There will also be things that cannot be footnoted properly and proven. Okay, so with that warning, Halloween. In the 1860s and the 1780s, during the American Revolution and Civil War periods of our history, here's something that Halloween revelry looked like. And Halloween revelry was going on the other side of the ocean in Ireland. So this wasn't a big holiday. This wasn't something people were familiar with around Columbia more than 150 years ago, except for the Irish community. Nobody did Halloween. But some of the customs that we see and practice today, they were there. They were just in unexpected places. For instance, trick-or-treating. Trick-or-treating happened. It would happen mostly among the Gullah and other low country slaves who had learned a custom from the lower class English immigrants who tended to be their overseers, and this custom had to do with Christmas caroling. Y'all heard that Christmas carol that's vaguely threatening? Bring us some figgy pudding, bring us some fig. We won't leave until we get some. So what you do is show up in a procession at the big house and you sing songs to get their attention, and then they're supposed to bribe you with treats. And then there were two other sets of songs, one of them praising the generosity of the people giving the treats, and one of them mocking the miserliness and pathetic nature of the people giving the treats. So you wanted to win the good song by offering the good stuff. This trick-or-treating style thing happened at Christmas. There was also a traditional night for the telling of ghost stories. Our ancestors, our forebears in this state loved ghost stories wherever they came from. It just seems to be kind of a human thing. People like these stories. But the night for telling ghost stories, and don't ask me why, was Christmas Eve. Y'all ever wondered to yourself, why did the greatest English writer of the 19th century write a Christmas story, only it's a ghost story? Shouldn't that be at Halloween? Not for Charles Dickens, because ghost stories were told on Christmas Eve. So, Halloween really comes in with the big waves of Irish immigration, first into the northern cities during the potato famine, but later on, the 19th century, you get to the 20th century, and Halloween had no trick-or-treating. It was a mischief night. None other than the Boy Scouts came up with the idea of, why don't we have something different than nasty tricks that night, although they kept the ominous part in there with trick or treat. And that's where that custom comes from. So a lot goes around about the customs of Halloween this time of year. A lot of it is bunk. And some of the truth, I think, is really interesting. But while they didn't have the holiday excuse to tell tales of gore and folklore, we do. So I'm going to launch into stories from several different history periods, some with a more direct connection to the museum, some with less. But we will start in colonial days with the weirdest local story, I think, that is out there. And that is the tale of the Weberites. Anybody heard of the Weberites? Some of y'all heard of the Weberites, and there might be some better presenters out there. You could definitely get a full session out of the story of these people. I like this description as recorded by Clayton Cleckley. This sect, a very strange sect known as the Weberites, arose among the German-speaking people in Saxe-Gotha and Lower Dutch Fork, 1756 through 61. So this is 15 years before the American Revolution, and it overlaps the Cherokee War. This cult originated along the lower Saluda River in the neighborhood of Jungender's Ferry. It originated with Jacob Weber, born in Switzerland, raised and educated in the Reformed Church. He came to South Carolina at the age of 14 and prospered early in life as a local planter. But the death of his brother caused him to brood about religion and the state of his own soul. In May 1756, inner excitement reached a climax in his soul-searching experiences. Weber shared his religious enthusiasm with his neighbors by inviting them in for Sunday hymn singings and readings from sermon books. And in those days, sermon books were pretty common. You didn't have a local preacher, you read the sermon from a great preacher. Didn't start off too badly. He was encouraged by the response he received. Gradually, participants began to admire the reader, which in turn caused him to admire himself.
The more recognition he received, the more esteem he had for his own talents. And there was a visitation system, but a German-speaking pastor visited this isolated community twice a year or less. And in between, these people out in the wilderness and under the danger and terror of the Cherokee War. People were terrified of the Cherokees. And there was reason for that if you study that period. Well, in this pressure cooker, Jacob snapped. He kept all of his charisma and personal magnetism. And he concluded that he had gotten pretty close to God. In fact, that, well, actually, when you really thought about it, that he was God himself. He began to preach out of his own spirit, is the phrase here, winning over 2 co-workers who also had extraordinary revelations. And that was apt, since if you're going to be God, you really need the Trinity going on. And they declared that all 3 of them were the members of the Trinity. Jacob Weber representing and acting as God the Father, Schmidt Peter the Son, and a third person, Mr. Dauber, identified as being of mixed ancestry, the Holy Spirit. Jacob Weber's wife was declared the Virgin Mary. Gets awfully complicated, and it gets worse. With this organization, the sect grew stronger and practiced the most atrocious blasphemies. Neighbors joined it eventually because they feared for the safety of their lives. And groups of both sects went about unclothed and naked. That's an interesting phrase. Not only were they unclothed, but they were naked. Unclothed and naked, and practiced the most abominable, wanton atrocities, often fell into trances and repeating. Sanctioned nudity seems to be a theme. But the leaders began to quarrel among themselves. Jacob and Schmidt agreed that Dauber was not properly exercising the office of the Holy Spirit. So, as one does, they placed a mattress on the bottom of the pit, threw him in, and piled more mattresses and pillows on him. Members of the sect then leaped in and trampled until he suffocated. Wow. The corpse was taken out of bed and thrown into a burning pile of wood to be consumed to ashes. In Lexington. This was not the original Shealy's barbecue. Soon afterwards, having annihilated one member of their own self-declared Trinity, the other 2 members fell out, and Schmidt Peter ended up chained to a tree. He was beaten up and then trampled, and rumors began to go out of this little community of how far off the rails everything had gone. Well, an investigator was sent to take care of this. The new traveling German Reformed preacher was a man named Christian Theus. And Christian Theus went out to investigate the Weberites in their community and to see if rumors of really weird stuff going on were true. And he was greeted cordially and invited into the community and then to observe one of their meetings. Well, Christian Theus, during the meeting, was kind of surrounded and pressured to be catechized into saying that Jacob Weber was God. A pretty solid Lutheran, Christian Theus, instead found an exit and took off. Now this would make a fantastic movie. In the dark, in old Lexington County, in the wilderness, he's running through the woods with maniacal screaming cultists running after him, and he made it to the river. And there at the river, he found or was already aware of a canoe that had been stowed there. He jumps in the canoe and heads away. And he made it down to Charleston to give a full report on the activities. Now, you would think that the cult would respond to somebody having gotten away and telling this story in some drastic fashion and make some precautions or do something. They did not. They were so certain that they were right that they waited for him to bring back the militia, which put everybody involved under arrest. And then they attempted to give a legal defense about how what they had done was righteous and just and the proper thing to do. The authorities of the colony did not agree. Jacob Weber, his wife Hannah, remember the Virgin Mary, John Geiger, and Jacob Burghardt were convicted and sentenced to death. From the Charleston Gazette, April 25th. On the 5th, some unhappy wretches who in a fit of religious enthusiasm had in a most barbarous manner murdered, oh, I didn't mention the other couple of people they killed in between while Christian was delivering the report. A traveling salesman was one of them. Were brought down from thence and committed to jail. The delusion was so great that they acknowledged the murders and for some days attempted to justify themselves. At March sessions, they were too well convinced of their error. 7 of them indicted and tried, and 4 convicted. The 4 we've listed all received sentence of death. And on the 17th, Jacob was hanged pursuant to his sentence, behaving in a very becoming manner and dying a true penitent. The other 3 were reprieved until May. Well, there's some correspondence still around that was sent to the governor, begging him to pardon the remaining 3. I thought Hannah Weber, John Geiger, and Jacob Burghardt, who acted by his commands, to be proper objects of His Majesty's mercy, and therefore reprieve them till His Majesty's pleasure therein shall be known. I beg leave to inform you of the nature of their sentence. In the remote part of the province, beyond the Congarese, where there is no Dutch minister, these ignorant Germans, from a pious desire of having some religion, had unhappily formed a sect of enthusiasts. Jacob Weber, who unpiously called himself the Most High, etc., etc., the deluded people immediately seized Smith Peter and with all the rage of religious persecution beat him to death without remorse. In order to put a stop to this goil, I thought it necessary that one, the chief, should suffer. And as public justice is therefore satisfied, and as Hannah, John, and Jacob, each with numerous families, bear the character of being long known, orderly, and industrious, to recommend them as objects worthy His Majesty's most gracious pardon, I may further represent to you they are poor, have no friend but your compassion, and no money. Well, they would be pardoned, but in the sentence, members of the Weberite sect were forbidden to settle within 50 miles of one another or in Lexington District. So at least one of the exiles was apparently exiled to Richland County. Then we have, in the aftermath, a great little pilgrimage site for you to go to, Sandy Run Church's historic graveyard. Christian Theus, this was the beginning of his adventures in the colony, but he would be a distinguished Lutheran minister for the rest of his career. And no Halloween presentation is complete without a great gravestone. Now this is the re-engraving in 1986, but the grumpiest gravestone in our state, I think. This faithful divine labored through a long life as a faithful servant in his master's vineyard, and the reward which he received from many for his labors was ingratitude. So right there on the tombstone in the churchyard to remind the church members that they just didn't treat him right. Moving forward to the Revolution and to the developing story. Things are still being learned of the well-known, famous South Carolina legend of the Headless Horseman of Hobkirk's Hill. Now, Headless Horsemen have been a theme. They've been enough of a theme that J.K. Rowling made fun of the whole concept by introducing to Hogwarts the Headless Hunt Club and all of these riders who wished to be admitted to the club, and they had to both be equestrians and have had their heads completely cut off. And there was no shortage of characters in folklore who could qualify for the headless hunt. This particular engraving is an Irish one. It's unusual because the horse is headless too, in this case. But the most famous depiction is the wonderful short story by Washington Irving, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. That was written in 1820. It has a long legacy in our culture, and it is contended that it is probably partly inspired by the Headless Horseman of Hobkirk's Hill. Now, the Hobkirk's Hill fight, we have General Greene going up against Lord Rawdon in command of the Patriot and the British forces that day. And during Greene's retreat, there was a ferocious fight over some cannons. And you see in after-action reports, it's very important. It's a big feather in your cap if you've captured the enemy's cannons. Conversely, having lost your guns is a great disgrace. And for practical reasons, having a few guns made you a much more effective fighting force than otherwise. So a group of cannons were in danger of being captured during the precipitous retreat. And this is when, as the British commander, you're going to unleash your cavalry to try to do that job. General Greene sends some of his regulars, and the legend is, before the day was over, Greene himself had dismounted from his horse and put his shoulder to the wheel to help save one of these cannons. But they were under constant harassment by a group of cavalry, a group of loyalist cavalry from New York State. Aptly enough, they were commanded by a certain John Coffin. Well, John Coffin's cavalry, one loyalist soldier. Now, there is ongoing dispute about the Headless Horseman, whether he represents a patriot or a loyalist. The sources I've looked at so far indicate pretty strongly that it was a member of John Coffin's loyalist cavalry who took an unfortunate round to the head. Randall Askew is a friend of mine, a Oxford scholar and former infantryman, who takes great interest on what happened on the land that he lives on, land that those cannons were actually placed on during the battle. And he's pretty sure that he has narrowed it down, and if he can find the surgeon's reports, is going to actually be able to identify which trooper this was. But whichever trooper it was, the cannonball that took off his head didn't disturb his progress in any other way. The horse with the headless rider continued galloping in full sight of the troops, galloped across the field, and then turned and galloped off into Black River Swamp, where it was never seen again, at least in physical form. Now, if I saw a soldier with no head riding past me on the battlefield, I think that would burn itself into my memory pretty solidly. I think I'd remember that. And I think that on bad days, I would see it all over again, because that's the kind of thing that makes an impression. Well, the legend arose. That particularly when the swamp is covered with a misty fog on the night of a full moon. Because that's the time to do these things. When the swamp is covered with a misty fog on the night of a full moon, a decapitated ghost mounted on a skeletal horse gallops around the swamp, rides up through the cemetery and the surrounding countryside, and returns at dawn to his watery haunts. Apparently, the miserable specter is still searching for his missing head.
Have you heard that?
Well, this story from Hobkirk's Hill, my friend Randall says he'll probably never be able to prove that this is the primary story on which Washington Irving's famous tale was based. That before long we're going to know, hopefully, exactly which of the members of Coffin's Light Cavalry was not able to find a coffin, but instead is somewhere in the swamp without his head. This story I couldn't help adding because of its strong pop culture impact. The first film version of The Headless Horseman was in 1922, starring Will Rogers. And of course, the Disney version will probably always be the most famous. So, from Headless Horseman, we go on to a South Carolina character, some of whose things we do have on display at the museum. In particular, there's a beautiful engraved revolver given to Matthew Culbraith Butler by his commanding officer's sisters, with whom he flirted outrageously. It's engraved with his name on the back strap, and there was a matching sword as well. It's held by another museum. But General Butler was a real character, and a character, as I will explain, who did not lose his foot. Butler, if you're going to talk about the stereotype of the Southern Cavalier, he comes pretty close. A wealthy man in private life, a dashing and handsome individual, a guy who wrote, I think, what is the worst love letter I've ever seen in my life. It's quoted in the book Southern Hero, Matthew Culbraith Butler. He writes to his long-suffering wife, comparing her with several other categories of women, saying that I have danced with the blonde beauties of New England. I have embraced the beauties of Virginia. He goes through an extensive list, including, I have fondled the dusky beauties of the tropics. But you, my dear, excel them all. Now, just to add to that, Butler had never left the state of South Carolina before his marriage. His long-suffering wife remained with him, and I commend to you that biography of this really interesting man, a really good battlefield commander, but also a show-off. Cavalry commanders and the stereotype of the fighter pilot often had a lot in common. When your main advantage is to move fast, you got to be decisive, and decisive often comes along, this was a high testosterone guy in every sense of the word. And he was known for not carrying weapons into battle. That's why the Hampton sisters gave him something. Because he carried his riding crop and said, well, if somebody grabs my bridle, I'll hit him with this, but my job is to command. Just one more way he showed off. Well, one day he showed off too much. It was the Battle of Brandy Station, usually marked by historians as the first time that the Union cavalry is almost on a par with the Confederate cavalry. It's more of an even up fight than it has been in the past. And Matthew Butler is receiving a report that morning from a scout, a well-known scout from South Carolina. And it's Captain Farley. We have one of Farley's holsters, by the way, in our holdings. And Captain Farley is telling, they're both mounted men, they're faced in opposite directions. And Captain Farley says, now, sir, the first thing you need to understand is that if you look really careful, I've located that there's a cannon that's being set up, and we are definitely in range. And Butler looks through his field glass and agrees, yes, they're setting up an artillery position there, you're right. You know they always miss with the first shot. Please continue your report. As the black humor of history would have it, the first shot was dead on, and dreadfully so. The ensuing scene was truly horrific. The ball tore off Farley's leg, penetrated his horse. It went all the way through Farley's horse to hit Butler's horse and to destroy his right foot on the other side. Both men hit the ground, both horses, doubtless entrails trailing, dashed off in opposite directions like a mortally wounded deer to fall when the reflexes failed. Butler, as I say, he had his character problems, but lack of courage was never one. And apparently he crawled over to Farley, tied a tourniquet on the stump. When they got there, the stretcher bearers got there, Butler said, take Farley first. He's hurt worse than I am. Which was a pretty close run thing because his foot was all but amputated by the shot. Farley, I'd overcome with blood loss and everything else, he held up the stretcher bearers and he said, wait, bring that, indicating his leg. And he insisted that they put the leg on the stretcher with him and carry him off. Well, they came for Matthew Butler as well, and seeing that he could do nothing about this grievous wound, Dr. Benjamin Walter Taylor of Trinity Episcopal here in town, distinguished doctor before and after and during the war, but he had to amputate. He cut off Butler's foot, and Butler would return home on a wooden foot. A couple years later, when he went out to review the troops before Congaree Creek, he was stomping on that wooden bridge with a fake foot. It didn't keep him out of action as long as one would expect. He spent a few months recovery, during which he flirted outrageously with Wade Hampton's sisters. And then he went back to battle for the rest of the war. But he kept a souvenir with him. Maybe seeing Farley had made him think this way, I don't know. He insisted that his foot be wrapped up and preserved, embalmed, and kept with him so that he would be buried, all the pieces in the same place. A amusing aftermath of this is that his kids got into the attic one day, not knowing what was in that foot locker. And I'm happy to say that we actually brought it with us. No, we did not bring it with us today. However, Matthew Butler's foot was not lost but retained and was apparently buried with him. Edgefield has some great Southern Gothic burial stories. The wife of Albert Bland. Now, Colonel Bland's opera glasses are on display at our museum as well, and they have a round lodged in them. They were in his coat pocket when he was knocked off of a horse. He survived that day. He did not survive the war. And Mrs. Rebecca Bland was devoted to her husband. It was tradition to wear all black for a year and a day. And then you went into various stages of mourning. Not Rebecca, she wore nothing but black for 30 years. Rebecca Bland had a last request on her deathbed. The deacons of her church were there, and I want to be buried with my husband. And they said, of course, Mrs. Bland, we've got the spot laid out right next to him in a church graveyard. No, I didn't say next to him. You dig that coffin up, you open it, and you put me in there with him. And being good Southern boys, the deacons of her church said, yes, ma'am. And that's what happened. There are 2 skeletons in that box down in the cemetery of a little Baptist church in Edgefield. I have some great volunteers in the museum. Many of them have outranked me. I've had generals and colonels as museum volunteers. But only one of our museum volunteers has really had direct experience of the 1860s. So we're happy to have Weller Rothrock occasionally making his contributions to the museum. You see, Weller Rothrock was a teenage soldier the last year of the war. It wasn't a really big part of his life in time, but it made a huge impression on him. And Weller Rothrock became devoted to the idea of preserving the memories of the war. He would attend all of the Confederate veterans reunions that he could get to, and thankfully for us in our collection, he saved all the stuff. If there was a reproduced medal, if there was a printed ribbon, if there was something that showed he had been to that United Confederate Veterans event, he saved that thing, sometimes with his name on it. He also purchased, and it was probably less than $20, what was likely a nicer uniform than he ever had while he was in service during that last year of the war. The Confederate Veterans event uniforms, you could tell them, for one thing, because the buttons actually have a Confederate battle flag on them, something that never happened during the war. And Weller Rothrock's uniform went into our collection upon his death, along with all the other things that he had collected. When he passed away in 1913, he wanted this stuff taken care of. Now, the relic room has been in 5 locations over the years. And if you've moved a home, multiply the difficulties when you're moving a museum. You know, to move tens of thousands of artifacts and keep track of them all is not something I ever want to have to do again. And I came on board just on the unboxing phase of that with the relic room. And in the course of this moving in 2001, we had the chance to re-lay out the whole museum, reinterpret things, set things up in a way that made sense in a lot more space than in the previous location. Anybody in the room visit the old location on Sumter Street? So you all know that to me that was a charming place, but it had grown up organically and it was crowded and confusing. So we were covering different topics and we had a while to get things ready, and that included preparing mannequins. That's a standard Dorfman mannequin on the right there. And in the course of all this moving stuff around, an item belonging to Weller Rothrock's collection was mislaid. It was there, it was safe, but it wasn't properly labeled and it wasn't with the rest of his stuff. And meanwhile, the Veterans Reunion uniform we had on a mannequin in the prep room, and we began joking about it. I was part of the collections at the time, and we began joking about this because if you left that mannequin alone, it slumped. The right arm out.
And you went home for lunch and came back, and the formerly did that. And you know, you went home at night, came back in the morning. Then we found the missing item from Weller Rothrock's stuff. It was the silver-headed cane that he carried to all of the reunions. So the joke grew up among us that he was reaching for his non-existent cane, was reminding us of the cane, getting everything. And then one day, a couple of weeks later, another employee who was not privy to this joke or this pattern and had not heard us telling stories about it, well, she came in to say, why is it that the drawers in the exhibit, they're always closed when I go home in the evening, and I find them open in the morning? Those drawers are right next to that uniform, and they're filled with Weller Rothrock's keepsakes from his reunions. So clearly the man did not want his stuff overlooked, and he liked the drawers open where people could actually see his collection. I absolutely cannot swear that I have found the drawers open on a day when I knew that they were closed. One thing about ghost stories, they're great for promoting history. If you own a bed and breakfast in Charleston and you don't have a ghost, I think there's a city department you could probably apply to have one sent to you. Because the stories add interest. Well, to me, the story with Weller Rothrock is most important because it does reflect something that's 100% true. And that is that the veterans really cared about how they would be remembered. That they would be remembered and how they would be remembered. Hopefully we're doing a good job because I haven't seen the mannequin moving. Seems to be quite content. We do have some very realistic mannequins if you've ever been to the relic room. And my hat's off to our director who made the call on moving from the old location. At the old location, some displays still had surplus department store mannequins. And it was Alan who made the call. We either do the professional blank white Dorfman form or high quality art on nothing else. Well, one of our high quality art mannequins represents one of the museum's founders, Miss Malvena, and she's sitting at her desk as a mannequin endorsing currency. That mannequin, and no other high-quality artistic mannequin, has started panics among grade schoolers several times because they say that she turned her head and looked at them. Never the World War I guy, never the Sharpsburg soldier, never the American Revolution soldier with a terrible scar down his face who looks scary. It's always Miss Malvena. The next tale moving forward involves the First World War period and a connection with the ship whose story, or lack of story, helped to really start the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. And this came up when we were researching programs 10 years ago. And as I attempted last night to reestablish the strong South Carolina connection, it might not be as strong as I thought. A reference to Carolina sailors of the Naval Reserve being aboard in a group may actually have been other Carolina. Nevertheless, the story of the USS Cyclops is worth contemplating for a moment if we're going to go through the wars in order, because it's one of the big mysteries of World War I. Cyclops was a U.S. Navy cargo ship with 3 sister ships, and sailing down into the Bermuda Triangle, her last message was, "Weather is fair, all is well."
And then in the single United States Navy incident involving the greatest loss of life outside a battle, the Cyclops and all 302 passengers and crew aboard vanished off the face of the earth. You can see an image here of the ship. A collier, which means that she was loaded with coal, which was very important in the First World War. All naval operations were fueled on coal. And U-boats were operating, so were German commerce raiders, surface ships. And when the Navy concluded that this ship was gone, her loss was attributed to enemy action. No enemy ships were located, and the Germans denied all knowledge afterwards or any interaction with this ship and said they had no warships in the area. And the Germans were not embarrassed to have sunk enemy ships. It wasn't something that would have caused a cover-up. But suspicion in several directions had already been awakened before her last voyage, leaving Barbados, sent to the Secretary of State from the U.S. Consul on Barbados. Confidential. Master of the Cyclops stated that required 600 tons coal, having sufficient on board to reach Bermuda. Engines, very poor condition. Not sufficient funds. Requested payment by me. Unusually reticent. I have ascertained he took here fresh meat, a ton of flour, 1,000 pounds of vegetables. From different sources, gather the following. He had plenty of coal. Alleged inferior. Took coal to mix. Master alluded to by others as damned Dutchman. This is the second time today somebody has said Dutch when they meant Deutsch, and not German, and not Dutch at all. Apparently disliked by other officers. Rumored disturbances en route. Men confined and one executed. Also had some prisoners from the fleet in Brazilian waters. One life sentence. United States Consul General Gottschalk was a passenger. 231 crew, exclusive of officers and passengers. Many Germanic names appear. I have to suggest scrutiny. While not having any definite grounds, I fear fate worse than sinking, though possibly based on instinctive dislike felt toward the ship's master. It turned out that the ship's master was actually sailing under not a false name, but his legally changed name that he had changed to sound less German, as a lot of folks were doing at that time. But there's still no solid information, and the wreck of the Cyclops has not been found. But I told you she was part of a class of 4 colliers. One of them was converted into an aircraft carrier, the USS Langley, sunk by the Japanese in World War II. The other 2 both disappeared without explanation 20 years later in the Bermuda Triangle. You can see where this is the kind of thing that would definitely establish a legend. Undercutting it, the other 2 that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, U-boats were definitely operating at that area at that time in the Second World War, so I don't think we have to guess too hard about what happened to her. Nevertheless, however many Carolina sailors from one or the other were aboard the USS Cyclops, if you go to find a grave, you can find a memorial and a virtual cemetery for them, but they have never been found. Now I have 10 minutes left for one of my favorite stories today, because it's something I believe I've been able to figure out myself at the museum. And it has to do creature right there. Not the man wearing the hat, but the horse next to it. B.H. Teague was an important guy to our museum, the Teague collection that was given to us. He had a similar story to Weller Rothrock. He had fought in the last phase of the war. After the war, he became a prominent dentist, but he was dedicated to preserving the history and keeping stuff, especially weird little stuff. There's a case in our museum of items from the B.H. Teague collection, and many of them fit the real definition of relics. You know, nobody starts a museum in 2024 and calls it a relic room. The name itself, in a sense, is an artifact. Because, you know, I think of pilgrims going to see a saint's bones. A relic is something to make you feel closer to history, to give you a sense of connection, less than it is something to learn from. That's why we're a relic room and museum now. But some of the things Teague collected could very much be learned from. Others were pure relics. For instance, we have half of one of General Beauregard's teeth. Yeah, we're not going to learn about history from that tooth, but a Victorian dentist thought that it needed to be saved. Well, there's another item in the Teague collection with a Southern Gothic flair, because the typewritten card on that one indicated that it was a bullet that had killed a man in the Battle of Aiken in 1865. The man was Lieutenant McMahon of Tennessee, and other somewhat gruesome artifacts related. Well, Lieutenant McMahon and his horse were in a mounted action that day, and the Battle of Aiken, if you go see the reenactment, you'll see pretty standardized stuff with the available troops, because you can't really reenact urban mounted fighting. The real battle involved a lot of horsemen riding around downtown Aiken shooting at each other right over and amongst civilian property. And Lieutenant McMahon and his horse took bullets. McMahon fell in a lady's front yard. Daring the random bullets that were flying, a couple of members of the family went out and recovered the wounded McMahon, and they brought him into their house, where, unfortunately, he died on their couch. We have a chunk of the couch. She saved the couch, and part of the couch skin cut out in a square. This is the couch on which a wounded soldier died in 1865. Again, much more relic than artifact. But although McMahon perished, the horse shot in the neck. Well, horses were, there was a distinct shortage of animals. Both armies confiscated animals for their own use, but Sherman's policy was to destroy all horses and mules that the army couldn't use. It was economic warfare. It's also a way to make people hate you for 100 years. People like their horses. And there's old Jim wounded, and as the family story is passed down, and was recorded pretty early, the Confederate regimental representative came and found the wounded horse and said, okay, time to put this thing out of its misery. Almost certainly a dead horse at that stage in the war is going to turn into rations. But the family begged him not to, saying that they did not think that the horse was that damaged, that the horse could probably recover. Horses were very valuable. Can't you just turn a blind eye and forget this horse was ever here? Yeah, fine. Keep your dying horse. Old Jim recovered. Old Jim did not just recover, but hunted foxes for 10 years after the war. And if you know anything about that kind of riding, old Jim became quite the equestrian athlete. Perhaps he was just Jim at that point, and not old Jim. Others called him Wheeler, after the commander over all of the Confederate cavalry forces. The bullet removed from his neck was not forgotten. Teague kept it as one of his artifacts. This is from Confederate Veteran magazine in 1898. Captain B.H. Teague of Aiken sends this sketch. Old Jim Wheeler commenced his career as a war horse at Greenville, East Tennessee, and served much in and around Rome, Georgia. From there, he went with Peake's cavalry to Atlanta, and then with Wheeler's cavalry through Georgia, as that command harassed the outposts of Sherman's army. Thence to Aiken, where on February 11th, 1865, he was wounded in the neck by a rifle ball, which was cut out by his last owner, Mr. W.J. Williams, who gave it to this rider. His rider, Lieutenant McMahon, was shot at the same time, rider and horse coming to the ground together. The lieutenant died and lies buried in the family cemetery of Mr. Williams, who nursed the horse to recovery and had him for many years afterwards in service, when enfeebled by age, tenderly cared for the old veteran until he died August 19th, 1896, aged 37 years. 37 years is a very long time for a horse, and he was one of the last two surviving Civil War horses in the nation. The competition was with a town in Pennsylvania that had a horse named Old Ned, the last living Union horse. Now, I'm sorry to say that Old Ned managed to eke it out 2 years longer than Old Jim and win the contest. Although, Old Ned was a captured horse, and so no one was able to ask him whether his loyalties lied with one side of the sword or with the other. So, with that said, does anybody here have a favorite, and I'm not going to ask you to recite it. Anybody have a favorite Halloween or spooky poem? I have had one for a very long time, since I discovered it in Rudyard Kipling's Barrack Room Ballads. It is a poem called The Undertaker's Horse. And Rudyard in The Undertaker's Horse is contemplating this animal that he finds quite intimidating when he sees it around town, because he associates it with these funerals in British India. The eldest son bestrides him, or the pretty daughter rides him, and I often meet him mornings on the course, and there kindles in my bosom an emotion chill and gruesome when I canter past the Undertaker's horse. Well, I'd like to introduce a tribute both to Rudyard Kipling and to Old Jim in honor of the Confederacy's last surviving equine veteran. No gray-clad soldier rides him, yet his place won't be denied him, plodding calmly in the veterans' parade. By his halter he is taken down the crowded streets of Aiken, while the spectators all cheer, and I'm dismayed. The old horse has never wronged me, and his ribs stand out so strongly you can count them like a sergeant counting roll. Yet he bridles at my pity, and with blatant audacity his old eyes seem to look straight into my soul. Neither shies he nor is restive, but an ominous, suggestive, slow march he clops out in military style, like the fall which follows pride. His inexorable stride says, "I'll get to you in just a little while." Oh, stud-bred of ill omen, how you used to charge the foeman, snorting like that horse in Job when bugles blew, on fields perilous and gory, hell for leather, death or glory. Now your saddle's empty, but death rides with you. Tell me, somber beast and drear, where's that gallant volunteer, young Lieutenant McMahon, late of Tennessee? Together you were shot down in the streets of Aiken Town. Today you walk while he lies quietly. There's no reason I should blame you, and your record should not shame you, though 'twas you survived your wound and he did not. It could as easily have been he who lived to fight again, and you nearly went into the cooking pot. Yet, old Jim, you make me nervous. At each veteran's burial service, when the bugle has played taps in proper style, you nod to me as if to say, it was not your turn today, but I'll slow march for you too. Just wait a while. Even after you are dead, gallant rebel quadruped, and the hooves I dread have been turned into glue, I'm sure I'll still hear them beat, and this rhythm they'll repeat. Just be patient for a while, I'll get to you. Well, thank you very much. I thought it might add, we found this in our archives as well, and I did get special permission today to tote along a piece of a dead horse woven from old Jim's tail, along with a photograph of him. So if you'd like to get a close look at this after we close, I think it's a pretty neat little thing as far as relics go, to save a piece of the last surviving Confederate war horse's tail. And then there's this. It's on display. That's the bullet. This bullet was taken from the body of Lieutenant McMahon. I believe an error in transcription has occurred. The original Teague artifact cards are handwritten, and Dr. Teague's handwriting fits the stereotype of doctor's handwriting. It's easy to make a mistake reading a Teague card. Somebody at some point transcribed it. I don't think you dig through the body of a dead soldier to get the bullet that killed him. That's a little too Southern Gothic even for me. And Dr. Teague wrote in 1898 that he had in his possession the bullet that was removed from the neck of old Jim. So I am 90% certain that this bullet that we have on display in the relic case is actually the bullet that was removed from the neck of the horse and not the one that killed the rider. So that allows us to wrap things up on a solved mystery and not a remaining one. And the last hoofbeats of the cavalry in 1894, unless those hoofbeats were in 1914.
I've overrun my time for a bit, but I'll give a minute to one of the most famous of South Carolina's ghost stories, and like the loss of the Cyclops, something that does remain unexplained. In the autumn of 1914, a group of celibates were returning from a revival service where there'd been a great deal of preaching about the book of Revelation. And as they traveled down Bull Street, they saw one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. A spectral horseman was riding in the tree line along Bull Street, and they quickly reported that the end times were upon us and spread the word to all of their neighbors that one of the horsemen of the apocalypse had shown up. The next night, hundreds of people gathered to see whether the specter would reappear, and accounts in the newspaper and elsewhere, and in Nancy Roberts' famous books about South Carolina ghosts, they all insist that, yes, indeed, it did. But that second night, there were veterans among the crowd who clearly identified, saying, no, that's just Wade Hampton. So, the mounted equestrian statue there, sometimes that bit of folklore has morphed into the idea that the statue gets off its pedestal and rides around sometimes. I can assert that that does not happen, because I know deep in my soul that if it did, the first thing it would do would be trample the Ben Tillman statue. But in any case, one of our state's greatest figures is also one of our state's most enduring ghost stories. So I hope you enjoyed the potpourri of stories today, related by
nothing in particular except they all seemed interesting for Halloween. And again, I'd like to invite you all to come to our museum when we open again on December 6th. You'll have just enough time. You live in South Carolina, there is a war buff on your Christmas list. It is a demographic certainty. So you'll have just enough time to hit our gift shop up as well and get a Christmas present or two. Now, it's dangerous to open the floor for questions on a ghost story day, but does anybody have any?
Well, not a ghost question, but the museum's present location, was its previous location the old war memorial on Sumter?
Correct, yes, the World
How
War
long
I
had it-
building.
How long had it been there?
Since,
About
Alan?
74, 71, 72, somewhere in 1971.
When it
and
started
before
there?
that was in the
No.
State House.
When it left there? No.
That's when it first came there,
First
the
came
War
there.
Memorial Building,
From
which was
the
built as a
State House?
WPA project in the 1930s under
Yeah.
Roosevelt's administration. It was only there, and then that before that, USC's Navy ROTC had the whole building, then moved upstairs, and then slowly the museum took over. Before that, the museum was at the then new Archives and History building on Senate and Bull
Yeah.
in 1954. Before that, for 75 years, it was in a big room adjacent to the gallery of the Senate. And before that, it was at South Carolina Library.
Okay,
So
thank you.
it's moved around a lot.
It has.
Any ghosts that have made all those moves are very dedicated. I did have an unusual question one day, years and years ago at the museum. A lady was very taken with a particular uniform, and she was asking me questions about what kind of person, what circumstances, and they were weird questions. I concluded in my head that she had seen the cover of a North and South Harlequin romance, and that this reminded her of that because the question's a little off. And I was wrong. She eventually told me, somewhat shamefacedly, she was asking the question because she had seen somebody wearing that uniform riding a horse along the Riverwalk in Casey. That was the retreat route of the cavalry from Congaree Creek, an almost unknown engagement, and the uniform she was asking about was very appropriate to that setting and place. So maybe she was very cleverly making up a ghost story to freak me out, but if so, she learned some pretty obscure and specific questions to ask to back up her little practical joke there. And we have other stories from the museum, and any place that does history is going to accumulate these stories over the years of interesting characters that come in and interesting claims that are made.
All right.
All right, I ran over my hour. I do appreciate y'all being patient.
Let me
Happy
repeat.
Halloween.